May 19th, 1536. A queen knelt, a blade fell, and silence swallowed the crown. She was not beheaded in the public square. No screaming crowd, no jeering mob. Instead, an execution ground built in private. A sword imported from France, a select few to watch. Anne Boleyn, crowned Queen of England, was about to become its most tragic casualty. She had given the king a daughter. She had defied a church. She had changed the kingdom forever. And now she would die not for what she did, but for what she represented. A woman too clever, too outspoken, too visible, and that, in Tudor England, was unforgivable. Subscribe to Chronicles of Torment for more true stories history tried to bury. Like, share, and step inside the darkness. The court that crowned and condemned her. Before Anne Boleyn ever stepped into the throne room, the kingdom was already fracturing. The Tudor court, for all its jewels and splendor, was built on sand. Henry VIII sat on the throne, powerful, impatient, and haunted by a single, unrelenting problem. He had no male heir. For over 20 years, Catherine of Aragon had been his queen. She was royal by blood, noble in bearing, and once deeply loved. But love doesn't protect you when your womb won't deliver what the crown demands. Catherine had borne him a daughter, Mary, but no son survived infancy. And in Henry's eyes, a daughter was not enough. Not for legacy, not for peace, not for him. The court grew anxious. The clergy whispered. Foreign ambassadors reported back to Rome that the English king was growing restless. Then came Anne. Not as a foreign bride, not as a peace offering. She came through the back door as a courtier, a lady in waiting, the daughter of a diplomat, a woman with no royal blood, but with a foreign education, a dangerous charm, and a mind that would not yield. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in court, not by the era's standards. Too dark, too angular, but there was a magnetism about her. Anne spoke fluent French, could quote scripture and satire, and debated philosophy at banquets. She dressed boldly, French silhouettes, daring necklines. She laughed with men, but rarely at their jokes. And unlike her sister Mary, who had already been Henry's mistress, Anne said no. If you want me, you must make me your queen. That was not just resistance, it was heresy. A woman denying a king, demanding marriage. But Henry, obsessed, challenged, inflamed, accepted. And in that moment, Anne stopped being just a woman. She became a threat to a system. The problem was, Henry was still married. His attempts to seek annulment from the Pope were denied, not out of moral conviction, but political paralysis. The Pope couldn't offend Catherine's powerful nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. So Henry took matters into his own hands. He declared the Pope's authority null in England. He elevated himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. He appointed his own archbishop. He married Anne in secret. Then publicly annulled his first marriage retroactively. The kingdom gasped. Rome raged. The church split, all for a woman who hadn't even delivered a son. Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony in 1533. The first queen consort ever crowned independently since the Norman conquest. A merchant's daughter now standing beside a monarch not beneath him, but not everyone bowed willingly. Catherine still had loyalists. The clergy was divided. Parliament simmered. Foreign dignitaries recoiled. To them, Anne was not a queen. She was a usurper, a seductress, a witch. She had bewitched the king, they said. She had poisoned his soul. She had defiled the altar. But Anne wasn't intimidated. She stepped into court life not as a decoration, but as a political force. She advocated for religious reform, supported English translations of the Bible, protected radical scholars. She clashed with bishops. She interrupted council meetings. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't grateful. She was powerful and unapologetically so. In her rise was the echo of transformation, but also the seed of her destruction. Because in Tudor England, a queen could have influence, but not too much. The womb that could not win. Anne had done the impossible. She had risen from courtier to queen. She had weathered the hate, the sermons, the suspicion, and still worn the crown. And in September 1533, she gave birth, a girl, Elizabeth, a child born of revolution, not of royal blood on both sides, but of sheer defiance. And for a brief moment, it was enough. Henry paraded her, called her strong, spoke of her destiny, but behind the smiles, something began to rot. Henry was now in his 40s, still no legitimate son, still no clear heir, still haunted by the spectre of civil war should he die without one. Anne, once his obsession, became his obligation. Her body, once the kingdom's catalyst, now its disappointment. She promised him more, and she tried. One pregnancy ended in miscarriage, then another, and finally in 1536, the one that would break her, a male fetus. Nearly full term, lost. The timing was cruel. Just days earlier, Henry had suffered a fall during a jousting match, an accident that left him briefly unconscious. Rumors spread that he might die. When he awoke, it was to the news that Anne had lost the boy. He did not speak to her. That silence spoke louder than any accusation. At court, the whispers multiplied. It's a curse. God has withdrawn his favor. This was never a true marriage. And Henry began to drift, not just emotionally, but politically. Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, had caught his eye. She was everything Anne wasn't: submissive, quiet, uncomplicated. Anne saw it. She tried to confront him, tried to remind him who she was, what they had fought to build. But Henry, weary of conflict, hungry for peace, no longer saw her as a partner. He saw her as a problem. And problems in Tudor politics had simple solutions. Enter Thomas Cromwell. He had once been Anne's ally. Together, they had torn England away from the Pope. But now he wanted stability, obedience, control. Anne had enemies everywhere: clergy, nobles, former allies, and Cromwell knew how to use them. On April 24th, 1536, a formal investigation began. Within days, 5 men were arrested. Mark Smeaton, a musician, tortured into confessing. Henry Norris, a courtier, accused based on a passing remark. William Brereton, Francis Weston, and finally Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were wild. That Anne had seduced them, that she had plotted the king's death, that she had corrupted the moral fabric of the realm. Evidence, fabricated, testimony, coerced, justice, pre-written. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested. She was taken by barge to the Tower of London. Not as a guest, not as a queen, but as a traitor. She asked if it was a joke. She laughed, then wept, then prayed. She would spend the next 17 days in confinement, writing, hoping, watching her body, once glorified, now reduced to evidence. She never confessed. I have been a good wife to the king. I am innocent of all charges. My only sin was being too bold. But in truth, her trial had already ended before it began. The verdict wasn't about crime. It was about cleansing. Anne had miscarried the future. Now the court would erase the past. And so, a queen became a shadow. A crown is easy to take off, especially from a woman. The Tower didn't just hold Anne. It began to dismantle her. Each day was a subtraction, a title stripped, a right revoked, a belief shaken. She was not beaten, not yet, but she was being worn down by design. From the moment she arrived at the Queen's house, the transformation began. No guards bowed, no priest offered solace, no one called her Your Majesty. You may call me the King's wife, she once whispered, or call me traitor, but don't call me nothing. Her cell, dignified on paper, was a cage of mirrors. 2 maids were planted to watch her. Their reports were sent to Cromwell daily, not to ensure her safety, but to collect her unraveling. When she wept, they noted it. When she prayed, they wrote down the words. When she laughed, too loud, too sudden, they whispered that madness had begun. And outside, the trial of her alleged lovers had already been staged. One by one, the men fell. Mark Smeaton, a musician, was tortured until he confessed. Henry Norris, the king's own friend, betrayed by court gossip. George Boleyn, her brother, accused of incest, humiliated beyond comprehension. The charges weren't meant to be believed. They were meant to shock. This wasn't truth. It was ritual sacrifice, and Anne was the altar. When her trial began, the court had already decided. The men were gone, the people were silent, and the sword was being sharpened. Anne entered the courtroom still composed, not because she expected mercy, but because she refused spectacle. The gallery was packed. Nobles, spies, officials, even Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, sat watching, his loyalty long sold to the king. Anne stood alone. She had no legal counsel, no advocate, no right to cross-examine her accusers, only her voice and the echo it left behind. I do not understand how such things can be imagined of me, but I leave it to God. Cromwell did not blink, neither did the jury. She was declared guilty on all counts: adultery, incest, treason, sentenced to death, not by axe but by sword, a French blade, imported cruelty, marketed as merciful. It was Henry's final insult, not a public beheading, but a private erasure. Anne was told she had only a few days left. She used them to prepare. She asked to write to the king. She begged for Elizabeth's future to be protected. No reply came. She chose her execution attire herself, a grey cloak lined with fur for warmth and dignity, a crimson bodice, not for beauty, but because blood would not show. And each night she prayed aloud, to be heard, to be forgiven, to be remembered, if not as queen, then at least as mother. She whispered scripture. She hummed old French hymns. She smiled at the maids when she caught them writing her words. Do not worry, history will decide what they meant. The night before the execution, she could not sleep. She walked the room barefoot, touched the windowpins, stared at the stars if there were any. She was not asking for salvation. She was asking for silence. By the morning of May 19th, Anne Boleyn was no longer a wife. She didn't just lose her head. They took her voice, her name, her legacy. May 19th, 1536. A morning with no music, no procession, no tears from heaven. The Tower had prepared not a scaffold for a queen, but a stage for forgetting. No commoners allowed, no crowd to mourn, just whispers, wood, and a sharpened foreign sword hidden in straw. Anne's execution was not public justice. It was private disposal. She emerged from the Queen's house with grace no one had earned from her. No trembling, no collapse. Just the slow, steady walk of a woman forced to make peace with the inevitable. A prayer book clutched in one hand, the other steady by her side. She wore a cloak of grey lined with fur, shielding her from the chill. Underneath, crimson silk, not for vanity, but because blood vanishes into red. She walked across the green like a ghost, already half removed from the world. Thomas Cromwell stood near the platform. He didn't smile, he didn't flinch, but he watched every second. As the queen he had helped destroy walked toward her appointed silence. He had traded faith for favor. She would pay in blood. Charles Brandon, the king's old friend, remained stone-faced. Jane Seymour, waiting somewhere inside the tower, was already measuring her fingers for Anne's ring. The moment Anne stepped onto the scaffold, a queen ceased to exist, and a cautionary tale began. Her final speech, calm, composed, wasn't for the crowd. There was no crowd. It was for her daughter, for history, for heaven. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. I do not say I am justly condemned. She asked for no revenge. She blamed no one, even Henry. He hath always been a good, gentle sovereign to me. Not because she believed it, but because she knew Elizabeth was listening, even if only in memory. Anne knelt. Her ladies stepped forward. They blindfolded her with practiced hands, tucked her thick dark hair beneath a linen cap. Her breathing deepened, not fast, just certain. She had practiced for this, not death, but how to die when the world is watching and pretending not to care. The executioner, brought from France to guarantee a cleaner cut than English axes, raised his hand. Then spoke, "Fetch me the sword." The blade was already in his grip. Anne turned slightly, reacting to the voice. One final instinct. To believe the world would give her a moment more. That's when the sword fell. A single arc, clean, final. Unmerciful, her head fell into the straw. Her body slumped forward, both still, both quiet. The silence wasn't sacred, it was systemic, a silence that wanted forgetting. Her ladies stepped forward again, but now their hands were different. Shaking, not from fear, from grief choked down too long. They collected her remains, head and body, and placed them inside an arrow chest. Rough wood, no lining, no coffin had been ordered, a queen placed where weapons once lay. As if her body was just another tool of war, now discarded. She was buried that same day, beneath the floor of St. Peter ad Vincula. No plaque, no hymn, no crowd, just the whispers of those still alive enough to regret her. Inside the tower, the walls didn't remember, but the air did. Henry wasn't there. He was already writing letters, preparing a wedding, planning a future where Anne's name was never spoken again. Within 11 days, Jane Seymour became queen. This wasn't a fall, it was a rewriting, a removal, a regime erasure. She died quietly, but her absence was loud. The sword had done its job, the body was gone, but Anne's execution didn't erase the discomfort, it amplified it. Inside the tower, servants whispered. Guards looked away. Even the stone seemed unsure how to hold what had just happened. Anne Boleyn was buried in silence. But outside the walls, England was stirring. To some, her death was a sigh of relief. To others, a miscarriage of justice wrapped in royal ceremony. Just 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. No mourning period, no hesitation, just a reset. A clean slate, painted over with wedding lace and political convenience. But no matter how fast the crown moved, the blood hadn't dried, the court changed, Anne's allies disappeared, her enemies rose higher. And yet no one truly celebrated, even those who despised her, envied her courage, feared her ghost. Foreign ambassadors wrote in code, the French whispered of barbarism. Even the Holy Roman Emperor's men, no fans of Anne, called the trial a sham. Something was wrong, and everyone knew it. Elizabeth was just 2 years old, declared illegitimate, her title stripped, her household reduced. She was not a princess anymore, just a child with royal blood and no place to belong. They sent her away, out of court, out of sight, but never out of danger. She didn't cry, not in public. Because even at that age, Elizabeth understood what silence meant. The legacy Anne left behind wasn't wealth, wasn't land. It was instability. Henry had broken with Rome, created his own church, rewritten the rules of marriage and legitimacy. But now, the queen who pushed him to do so was branded a traitor. Her name erased, her daughter sidelined, her faith doubted. If Anne had been wrong, then what did that say about the new church, about Henry's authority, about the soul of the nation? Cromwell, the man who orchestrated her fall, stayed in power for a while, but even he couldn't escape the stain. Years later, he too would be beheaded by the same king, in the same tower. For the same reason, he became inconvenient, and still no one spoke Anne's name, not in court, not in church, not in song, only in whispers, only in fear. They tried to erase her. Her daughter made her unforgettable. Anne Boleyn died beneath a sword, but she lives in the shape of a crown. The very daughter they tried to disinherit would one day sit on the throne, Elizabeth, just a child when her mother vanished. No title, no allies, no protection. Yet inside her burned something sharp, something inherited, not her father's appetite, but her mother's fire. As Elizabeth grew, she wasn't raised on stories of love and courtly triumph. She was raised on absence, on the cold memory of what happens when a woman reaches too far. She wore her pain like armor. She trusted few, spoke carefully, learned quickly, and always remembered. She wore a ring, small, elegant, with a miniature portrait of herself, and a hidden image of Anne beneath the surface, not for display, for devotion. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, the daughter of a disgraced woman, the product of a marriage deemed invalid, she didn't just take the throne, she reclaimed a legacy. One of her first quiet acts, to place a marble marker over Anne's grave. No parade, no sermon, just dignity returned. A queen finally buried as one. History began to shift. Anne was no longer just the seductress, or the traitor, or the mistake. Writers, scholars, and reformers began to see her not as a warning, but as a spark. A woman who dared to speak in a world that told her to smile, who pushed a king toward transformation, who paid with everything, so her daughter could be something more. The Elizabethan age, a time of literature, diplomacy, strength, wasn't born from peace. It was born from pain, from blood, from a name that refused to disappear. Anne was never canonized, never redeemed by the church, but in the eyes of a nation. She became something more powerful than holy. She became necessary. And even now, centuries later, her name still stirs debate. Her life still divides opinion. Her death still chills the heart. But through it all, one truth remains. They killed Anne Boleyn to forget her. And in doing so, they made her unforgettable. She died, not with fury, not with fire, but with grace. And somehow, that made it even harder to watch. I used to think history was about winners. Kings, wars, thrones. But Anne Boleyn wasn't a winner. She was removed, neatly, efficiently, legally, like a stain on the fabric of power. And yet here we are, talking about her, 5 centuries later. Why? Because some people don't just live in time, they disturb it. Anne disturbed it. She questioned what a queen should be. She refused to stay quiet. She chose intellect over obedience. She reached for something more, and paid in blood. That doesn't make her perfect, but it makes her real. And in a world where history often silences women, she still speaks. Speech balloon, maybe you saw a villain, maybe a victim, maybe both. But if Anne Boleyn's story still makes us pause, still makes us question what power does to people, then she never really left. Want more stories like this? The ones they don't put in textbooks. The ones too complicated, too human, too haunting. Click into our playlist, Medieval Tragedies They Don't Teach You. Like if it hit you. Subscribe to Chronicles of Torment if you believe some truths deserve discomfort.